When Shaquille O'Neal pushes open the door of a small diner on its very last night in business, he has no idea the woman behind the counter once fed him a meal he could not pay for, 33 years ago, before the world ever knew his name. It is Friday, December 4th, 2026, 8:52 p.m. Corain's Kitchen, Vineville Avenue, Macon, Georgia. Taped to the glass of the front door, at exactly eye level, is a small handwritten note on a torn piece of notebook paper. Shaq reads it once, and instead of walking inside the way he planned to, he lowers himself onto the bench outside and sits down. By the time this story is over, you will understand exactly what 4 sentences on a torn piece of paper could do to a man his size, why a 79-year-old woman was closing the doors of the only business she had ever owned, and what happened 3 weeks later that neither of them saw coming. Stay with us through this whole story. Corain's Kitchen sits on a quiet stretch of Vineville Avenue, wedged between a shuttered auto parts store and a laundromat that closes at 9. The building is narrow, brick-faced, its single front window fogged faintly from the warmth of the griddle inside meeting the cold December air outside. A string of small white Christmas lights, half of them burned out, still blinks weakly along the top of the window frame, left up from some earlier season and never quite taken down. The smell that drifts out through the propped side door is thick and familiar. Fried chicken, collard greens, cornbread baked in a cast-iron skillet that has been seasoned for longer than most of tonight's customers have been alive. A hand-painted sign above the door reads Corain's Kitchen, Est. 1980. The paint faded to a soft, chalky blue. Frost has begun to form along the bottom edge of the front window, and a rusted metal chair sits folded against the brick wall outside, unused for years but never quite thrown away. A single car idles in the small gravel lot, its exhaust curling upward into the cold night air, waiting for someone still inside finishing a late meal, the low rumble of its engine the only sound on an otherwise silent stretch of road. Shaq had not planned to stop here tonight. He was driving back roads on his way from a charity golf event outside Atlanta to a flight out of the Macon Regional Airport the next morning. The kind of quiet, unglamorous drive he preferred when he had the time for it. Radio low, no entourage, just him and several hundred miles of Georgia highway. He had noticed the diner's lit window from the road, one of the only businesses still open on this stretch at 9 o'clock on a Friday night, and something about the warm glow against the cold dark street had pulled him off the highway without much thought beyond wanting a hot meal before the drive continued. The golf event had run long that afternoon, handshake after handshake, photograph after photograph, and by the time he finally got on the road, he was craving exactly the kind of quiet, anonymous meal nobody would recognize him for ordering. The radio in the SUV had been tuned to an old soul station out of Atlanta for most of the drive, low enough to think over, the DJ's voice occasionally breaking in between songs with news updates Shaq only half listened to. He remembered noticing, as he slowed to turn off the highway, how few other cars were still on the road at that hour, how the small town seemed to have already settled into its evening quiet. He parked his SUV at an angle across 2 spaces in the mostly empty gravel lot, ducked out into the cold, and walked toward the door, his breath visible in short white clouds, his enormous frame casting a long shadow under the one working street lamp nearby, gravel crunching softly beneath his shoes in the otherwise silent night. It was the note taped to the glass that stopped him before his hand ever reached the door handle. The paper was ordinary notebook paper, torn along one edge from a spiral binding, a single strip of clear tape holding it flush against the inside of the glass. The handwriting was neat despite its slight tremor, the careful penmanship of someone who had been taught, decades earlier, that a letter worth writing was worth writing well, no matter how tired the hand doing the writing had become. Written in blue ballpoint pen, in a careful, slightly shaking cursive, 4 sentences filled the small torn page. Tonight is our last night. 46 years was a good run. Thank you to everyone who ever sat at this counter. God bless you all, and God bless this old kitchen. Shaq read it once. Then he read it again, standing perfectly still on the sidewalk, his hand hovering an inch from the door handle without touching it. For 9 full seconds, he does not move. His breath clouds the cold air in front of him, slow and even. His eyes stay fixed on the small torn page, the paper fluttering slightly at one corner where a single strip of tape has started to peel loose in the wind. 1 second. 2. His hand, still raised near the handle, lowers slowly back to his side. 3 seconds. 4. Through the fogged glass behind the note, he can make out the blurred shape of a small figure moving slowly behind the counter, alone, wiping down the same stretch of countertop over and over. 5 seconds. 6. A car passes slowly on Vineville Avenue behind him, headlights sweeping briefly across the note before disappearing into the dark street beyond. His breath comes out in slow, measured clouds, the cold biting at his exposed hands, though he does not move to warm them. 7 seconds. 8. 9 seconds. Shaq exhales, long and slow, turns away from the door, and lowers himself onto the wooden bench beside the entrance instead of walking inside. But to understand why a handwritten note about a diner's final night could stop a man like Shaquille O'Neal cold on a sidewalk in Macon, Georgia, you have to go back. You have to go back past the championships, past the business empire, back to a cold, broke 21-year-old rookie whose car broke down on this exact stretch of road 33 years earlier. In March of 1993, Shaquille O'Neal was in his first season with the Orlando Magic, already an enormous physical presence on the court, but still, in most other ways, a broke kid figuring out the world. He had driven up from Orlando that week to visit an old teammate from LSU who had settled near Macon, taking the back roads instead of the interstate because he liked watching small towns pass by the window, liked the quiet before the noise of his career got louder. His rookie salary, though substantial by most standards, had not yet caught up to the lifestyle everyone around him assumed he already had, most of his early paychecks going toward an apartment deposit, a modest car, and the beginnings of an endorsement wardrobe his agent insisted he needed. He still counted his money carefully that year. Still felt, more often than he let anyone see, like a kid from Newark who had simply been given an unusually large uniform to grow into. His car, a used sedan he had bought with one of his very first paychecks, sputtered and died on Vineville Avenue just after dark, radiator steam hissing up from under the hood. He had no cell phone worth relying on that year, no entourage, no assistant. He simply got out, locked the car, and started walking, looking for the nearest lit window. The night was cold for Georgia, colder than he'd expected when he left Orlando that morning, and he had only a thin team jacket to keep the chill off as he walked. His stomach had been growling since well before the car died, a long day of driving having eaten through the granola bar and soda that were the only food he'd packed for the trip. He remembered, decades later, counting his own footsteps on the cracked sidewalk, simply to keep his mind off how far he still had to walk. He passed a shuttered hardware store, a darkened laundromat, a church with its stained glass windows glowing faintly from some evening service still in session, before finally spotting the warm yellow light of Corinne's kitchen 2 blocks ahead, the only business on the entire stretch still clearly open at that hour. The nearest lit window belonged to a 13-year-old diner run by a woman named Corinne Duval, then 46 years old herself, her husband Otis, still alive in those years, working the grill most evenings while Corinne ran the counter and the register and, more often than not, the whole show, a division of labor that had settled naturally between them over more than a decade of marriage and shared work. Shaq walked in that night cold, embarrassed and hungrier than he wanted to admit, his wallet still sitting in the glove compartment of his broken-down car 3 blocks away. He asked if he could use their phone to call a tow truck. And Corinne, without asking a single question about who he was or why a young man his size was standing in her doorway looking half-frozen, told him to sit down first and eat something before he worried about anything else. Otis had glanced up from the grill when Shaq walked in, taking one look at the enormous, cold, clearly exhausted young man standing in the doorway, and simply nodded toward an empty stool without a word, the universal signal of a man who had seen plenty of strangers come through that door over the years, and knew better than to make a fuss over one more. The diner had been nearly empty that night too, just an older couple finishing dessert in a corner booth, and a young man reading a newspaper at the far end of the counter, the same quiet, unremarkable Tuesday night stillness that would echo, 33 years later, on the night everything came full circle. Shaq had folded himself onto the stool carefully, all too aware of how much space his frame took up in the narrow diner, embarrassed at the way the older couple glanced over briefly before returning to their pie. He remembered feeling for just a moment exactly the kind of self-conscious that came from being too big for a room not built with someone his size in mind. A feeling that had followed him through most rooms his whole life up to that point. She brought him a full plate without being asked, fried chicken, mashed potatoes, a thick slice of cornbread, the same plate she served every regular who sat at her counter. When he tried to explain, embarrassed, that his wallet was in the car and he had no way to pay her right then, she waved the concern away with one hand. "Eat first," she told him. "Worry about the money later. A man can't think straight on an empty stomach, and you look like you've been running on empty for longer than just tonight." He ate slowly at first, still embarrassed, then with growing appetite as the warmth of the food settled into him, Corain refilling his sweet tea twice without being asked, the older couple in the corner booth occasionally glancing over with quiet, kind curiosity at the enormous young stranger clearly enjoying his meal. He ate everything on the plate. When the tow truck finally arrived an hour later and he offered to run back with cash from his car, Corinne refused it outright, telling him the meal was on the house, that she fed hungry people first and worried about the register second, the way she'd been raised to do business her whole life. The tow truck driver, an older man named Hollis who ran the only garage still open that laid on the edge of town, arrived nearly an hour after Shaq's call, apologizing for the wait, explaining he'd been finishing another job across town. He whistled low when he saw the size of the young man waiting for him at the counter, joking that he'd need a bigger truck if the passenger seat was going to be part of the deal. Hollis and Corain clearly knew each other well, trading easy small talk while he finished his own cup of coffee before heading back out into the cold to hitch up Shaq's dead sedan. Before he left that night, she said one more thing to him, something he carried with him, in one form or another, for the next 3 decades. "You've got something in you, young man," she said, studying him with the particular clarity of someone who had spent decades reading people across a diner counter. "I don't know what it is yet, but I know it's something. When you get wherever you're going, don't forget to feed people when you get there. That's the only advice I've got for a stranger who walked in off the road tonight." Shaq had nodded, unsure exactly what to say to a stranger who had just fed him a full meal and offered him something that felt closer to wisdom than small talk, and climbed into the passenger seat of Hollis's tow truck for the ride back to his car. He watched the diner's lit window shrink in the side mirror as they pulled away, the warm yellow glow the last thing he saw of Macon, Georgia before the truck turned onto the highway, and the memory began, slowly, to blur into the general shape of his rapidly accelerating life. Shaq never went back to that diner. His career exploded within the following 2 years, road trips and back roads replaced by charter flights, and a life that moved considerably faster than a broken-down sedan on Vineville Avenue. He remembered the meal, remembered the kindness, in the vague way a person remembers a single warm moment buried among thousands of other memories. But the exact diner, the exact street, the exact name of the woman who fed him, had long since blurred into the general shape of a story he told occasionally without all its details intact. Corinne Duval, for her part, had no idea, in the years that followed, that the young stranger she fed one cold March night would become one of the most famous athletes in the world. She recognized him eventually, years later, seeing his face on a television commercial while folding laundry in her own living room, sitting bolt upright with the shock of recognition before laughing quietly to herself, half convinced she was imagining the resemblance. She never mentioned it to Otis, uncertain whether he would even remember one broken-down stranger among the thousands who had passed through their door by then, and felt a small private pride she never mentioned to anyone, filing the memory away the same way she filed away thousands of other kindnesses she had extended over 4 decades behind that same counter. Corinne's Kitchen had opened in 1980, the year after Corinne and Otis Duval married, using a small inheritance from Otis's father to lease the narrow brick building on Vineville Avenue. They had built the business slowly, one regular customer at a time, through recessions and highway construction that rerouted traffic away from their block and, in later years, through a pandemic that nearly closed them permanently, surviving each hardship through the same combination of stubborn will and quiet community support that had defined the diner from its very first year. Corain had grown up 2 streets over, the daughter of a seamstress and a factory worker, learning to cook standing on a wooden crate beside her own grandmother's stove. A woman who had insisted that a full plate was the first thing owed to any guest who walked through a door, family or stranger alike. Corinne carried that lesson into every single day she spent behind her own counter, never once questioning it, the way a person never questions the shape of their own hands. Her grandmother, a woman named Miss Ada who had lived through hardships Corinne only understood secondhand through family stories, used to say that feeding somebody who was hungry was the one form of charity that never embarrassed the person receiving it. "Everybody understands hunger," Miss Ada used to tell her granddaughter, standing over a simmering pot. "Nobody's ashamed of an empty stomach the way they're ashamed of an empty wallet. Feed the stomach first, and the wallet usually finds its own way to follow." Corain had never forgotten those words, had, in fact, built an entire life's philosophy around them without ever writing them down anywhere except in the quiet, unspoken logic of her own ledger. Miss Ada had passed away when Corinne was 19, but not before teaching her granddaughter every dish that would later fill Corinne's own menu. The collard greens simmered low and slow with smoked meat, the cornbread mixed by feel rather than measurement, the fried chicken seasoned the same careful way for 3 generations running. Corinne often said, in her later years, that every plate she served still carried a small piece of Miss Ada's hands in it, whether her customers ever knew it or not, a quiet inheritance passed down not through money or property, but through recipes memorized by feel and repeated faithfully for over 60 years. Otis had proposed to her in the parking lot of a different diner entirely, a now closed spot across town where they'd had their first date, telling her, half joking, that he figured a woman who cooked the way she did deserved a kitchen of her own to prove it in. They spent their first year of marriage painting the walls themselves, Otis building the counter by hand from lumber he'd salvaged from a torn-down barn outside town, Corinne sewing the first set of curtains for the front window on her mother's old machine. They opened on a Monday morning in April of 1980 with exactly 4 tables, 6 counter stools, and a hand-lettered menu Corinne had written out herself the night before, uncertain whether a single customer would walk through the door. Otis stood at the grill that first morning, nervous in a way Corinne had rarely seen from him, flipping eggs for a full hour before their very first customer. An elderly man from 2 blocks over finally wandered in for coffee, curious about the new sign. That same man, they would learn years later, became one of their most loyal regulars for the next 15 years, and Corinne liked to say, whenever she told the story, that a diner's whole future sometimes rides on one curious old man willing to try a cup of coffee from a place he's never heard of before. His name was Reverend Tillman, a retired minister who lived 2 blocks over, and he brought a different friend from his congregation nearly every week for the first several years, quietly building the diner's earliest customer base one introduction at a time, never once asking for anything in return beyond a good cup of coffee and honest conversation. When he passed away in 1998, half his congregation showed up at Corinne's kitchen the following Sunday, unprompted, simply because it felt like the right place to gather and remember a man who had spent his final years introducing an entire church family to the woman behind that counter. Otis passed away 12 years earlier, a heart attack in the diner's own kitchen on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday morning, and Corinne had kept the place running alone ever since, refusing every suggestion from her daughter and granddaughter that she sell the building and finally rest. She had found him herself that morning, collapsed beside the grill just after the breakfast rush, the smell of bacon still hanging in the air around him. She kept the diner closed for exactly 1 week after the funeral, the longest stretch those doors had ever stayed shut since 1980, and reopened the following Monday because, she told her daughter through tears, Otis would never have forgiven her for letting good customers go hungry over grief that belonged to her alone. The regulars who showed up that first Monday back found her standing at the grill herself for the first time in decades, refusing offers of help from half the neighborhood, insisting she needed the familiar motion of cooking to get through the day. She kept his old apron folded in a drawer behind the register ever since, never worn again, but never thrown away either. "This place has fed this whole neighborhood for 40 years, she told her granddaughter Simone more than once, usually while closing up alone late in the evening, Simone lingering to help even on nights she wasn't officially scheduled to work. "You don't just close the door on something like that because your knees hurt and your husband's gone. You close it when it's truly time, and not one day before." Simone had heard the speech enough times over the years to recite it herself, though she never once doubted her grandmother meant every word of it freshly each time she said it. But the past 18 months had been harder than any stretch since the pandemic. A new grocery store with a small hot food counter had opened 2 blocks away, pulling away exactly the kind of quick weekday lunch crowd that had always kept Corinne's kitchen afloat during the slower evening hours. The building's roof, original to 1980, had started leaking badly during the autumn rains, a repair estimate that ran well past anything Corinne had saved. Property taxes, reassessed upward as the neighborhood slowly gentrified around her, had climbed steadily for 3 years running, new townhomes and a boutique coffee shop appearing 2 blocks down, where a row of vacant lots had sat empty for as long as anyone could remember. Corinne had let go of her last part-time cook that spring, unable to keep making payroll on the thinning revenue, taking on the full weight of both the grill and the counter herself most days, an exhausting arrangement for a woman well past the age most people considered retirement. Simone helped when she could, splitting her time between the diner and a part-time job at a nearby pharmacy that actually paid enough to cover her own rent, guilt written plainly across her face every time she had to choose the paying job over her grandmother's counter. By November, Corinne had fallen 4 months behind on her property tax payments, a fact she had told almost no one, quietly moving numbers around in a ledger she kept by hand, the same worn ledger she had used since 1980. Watching the math simply refused to work no matter how she arranged it, adding and subtracting the same figures late into the night, in the vain hope that a different arrangement of the numbers might somehow yield a different result. She had tried, briefly, applying for a small business loan through her local bank, only to be turned down, the loan officer explaining, not unkindly, that her declining revenue over the past 18 months made her too much of a risk for the amount she needed. The loan officer, a polite young man barely older than Simone, had reviewed her paperwork carefully and told her, with visible discomfort, that the bank simply couldn't justify the risk on a business showing 3 straight years of declining revenue, regardless of how many decades it had operated successfully before that. Corinne had thanked him politely, gathered her folder of documents, and driven home in silence, understanding, with a clarity that felt almost like relief, exactly what path lay ahead of her now. She had considered, for a single difficult week, asking Simone or her daughter for help, before deciding against it, unwilling to let either of them shoulder a burden she considered entirely her own to carry. She told herself, during that week, that a woman who had spent her whole life feeding other people through their hardest moments ought to be able to manage her own without asking anyone to feed her in return, a private pride that had carried her through decades but now, for the first time, felt more like a weight than a strength. She lay awake more than one night that week, staring at the ceiling of the same bedroom she had shared with Otis for over 3 decades, running the numbers over and over in her mind, long after she had already exhausted every version of the math on paper. Some nights she found herself talking quietly to him in the dark, the way she still sometimes did 12 years after his passing, asking, half joking and half genuinely hoping for an answer, what he might have done differently, what he might have told her to do now. She made the decision alone, on a rainy Tuesday morning in late November, sitting at her own kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold, staring at a stack of unpaid notices she had finally allowed herself to open all at once instead of one envelope at a time. Rain streaked down the kitchen window in slow, steady lines, the same gray morning light she had woken to 1,000 other ordinary mornings, though this one felt different, heavier, the kind of morning she would later remember in precise detail for the rest of her life. She would close the diner. She would sell the building to whichever buyer offered fastest, likely the same development company that had already approached her twice that year about the property. She would pay off what she owed, keep whatever small amount remained, and finally, at 79 years old, stop. She decided, in that same quiet morning, that she would keep the diner open through one final Friday, rather than simply locking the doors the moment the decision was made. It felt important to her, though she struggled to explain exactly why, that the place get one last proper night, rather than simply vanish mid-week without ceremony. She told Simone only that she wanted to let the counter say a proper goodbye, a phrase that made her granddaughter cry the first time she heard it. She told her daughter, Simone's mother, only after the decision was already final, calling her on a Sunday evening and delivering the news in the same steady, practical voice she used for everything, refusing to let the conversation turn into the kind of drawn-out grief she didn't yet have the strength to sit inside of. Her daughter, who had moved to Atlanta years earlier for a nursing career and rarely made it back to Macon more than a few times a year, had begged her to at least consider a smaller loan, a fundraiser, anything short of closing outright. Corinne had gently refused every suggestion, telling her daughter that a woman her age had earned the right to close a door on her own terms rather than watch it get foreclosed on someone else's timeline. Her daughter had cried on the phone. Corinne had not until she hung up and sat alone in her kitchen for a long while afterward. She wrote the note for the door 3 days before that final Friday, sitting alone at the same counter where she had fed thousands of strangers over 46 years, her hand shaking slightly as she chose each word carefully, wanting it simple, wanting it true, wanting no trace of self-pity in 4 sentences that had taken her nearly an hour to write. She went through 6 different drafts before settling on the final version, crumpling each earlier attempt and tossing it into the trash can beside the register, unwilling to let even her own goodbye feel like it was asking for anyone's pity. One early draft had run nearly a full page, listing names, thanking specific regulars individually, before she decided it read too much like a eulogy and started over. Another draft mentioned Otis by name, and she had to set her pen down for several minutes after writing his name, unable to continue until the ache in her chest settled enough to keep her hand steady. A third draft, written late at night after a particularly exhausting shift, came out angrier than she intended, listing complaints about rising costs and shrinking margins, and she tore that one up the fastest of all, unwilling to let bitterness be the last thing this counter ever said to the people who had trusted it for so long. The final version, 4 short sentences, felt to her like the only honest way to say goodbye without asking anyone in the neighborhood to carry her grief alongside their own. Which brings us back to the sidewalk outside, to Shaq sitting on a wooden bench in the cold. The note's 4 sentences settling slowly into something closer to memory than he expected. 46 years, he says quietly, mostly to himself, the words forming a small cloud of breath in the cold air. Something in the number, in the particular phrasing of the note, tugs at an old memory he cannot yet fully place. He sits there for almost a full minute before finally standing, brushing off the cold, and pushing open the door. Inside, the diner is nearly empty. A bell above the door rings softly as he enters, the same bell that has rung for 46 years of customers walking through that same door. Fluorescent light hums overhead, warm despite its harshness, reflecting off a counter worn smooth by 4 decades of elbows and coffee cups. Vinyl booths line the far wall, patched in places with matching tape. A jukebox in the corner dark and unplugged, retired years earlier when the parts became too expensive to keep repairing. Though Corain had never let anyone haul it away, keeping it there as much for the memories attached to it as for any practical purpose. The floor tile, black and white checkerboard, has worn pale in a well-trodden path between the door, the counter, and the kitchen window. 4 decades of footsteps tracing the same practical route thousands of times over. A small radio sits on a shelf behind the counter, its antenna bent at an angle from some long-forgotten repair, still faithfully tuned to the same gospel station it had played since 1980, the volume low enough to be a comfort rather than a distraction. Only one customer remains, an older man in a flannel jacket seated at the far end of the counter, nursing a cup of coffee slowly, in no apparent hurry to leave. This was Walter Higgins himself, though Shaq did not yet know his name, sitting in the same seat he had occupied nearly every morning and more than a few evenings for over 20 years, unwilling to let the diner's final night pass without being there for it. Behind the counter, a woman moves slowly, wiping down the same stretch of countertop she has already wiped clean, the motion less about cleaning now than about having something familiar to do with her hands. She looks up as the bell rings, and for a moment her face carries the practiced automatic warmth of someone who has greeted strangers for 46 years, ready to say the same welcome she has said 10,000 times before. "Evening," she says, setting down her rag. "Kitchen's closing early tonight, but I've got enough for one more plate if you're hungry." Shaq crosses the small dining room and eases himself onto a stool at the counter, the seat groaning slightly under him the way most seats do. Up close, Corain Duval is smaller than she seemed through the fogged window. Gray hair pulled back in a low bun, a faded blue apron tied twice around her waist, deep lines around her eyes that speak of decades of early mornings and long nights. Her hands, resting on the counter as she waited for his order, showed the particular callous steadiness of someone who had spent a lifetime working a grill. Small burn scars faded pale along her forearms, a plain gold wedding band still worn on her left hand 12 years after Otis had passed. "I saw your note," Shaq says quietly. "Outside. I'm sorry you're closing." Corain's expression flickers, something tired and resigned crossing her face before she covers it with a small, practiced smile. "Everything's got its season," she says. "Mine's just come to an end, that's all. Now, what can I get you? Kitchen's low on a few things, but I can still put together a decent plate." "Whatever you've got left," Shaq says. "I'm not particular tonight." She moves toward the kitchen window to place the order with herself, the diner quiet enough now that Shaq can hear the low murmur of a radio playing gospel music somewhere in the back. The same station, he would later learn, she had kept tuned in every single day since 1980. While she works, Shaq studies the diner around him. Faded photographs line one wall, decades of regulars, staff and community events captured in slowly yellowing frames. A chalkboard menu, mostly erased now, still shows the ghost outlines of dishes crossed out one by one over recent weeks as supplies ran low. A cash register, the old mechanical kind with actual bells, sits at the end of the counter, its drawer propped slightly open, nearly empty. One photograph catches his eye in particular, a faded color print showing a much younger Corain and a broad-shouldered man in an apron, both of them laughing behind the same counter, a hand-painted grand opening banner visible in the background. Beside it, a newspaper clipping, yellowed and curling at the corners, shows a local feature on the diner's 20th anniversary, the headline barely legible anymore. Further down the wall, a series of smaller snapshots trace decades of regulars celebrating birthdays and graduations at the same worn tables, children growing into adults across the slowly yellowing progression of photographs. An entire neighborhood's history quietly documented one candid moment at a time. The older man in the flannel jacket at the far end of the counter, still nursing his coffee, glances toward Shaq with quiet recognition but says nothing, respecting whatever conversation was clearly unfolding between the diner's owner and this unexpected late customer. Something about the space tugs at him, familiar in a way he cannot yet fully place. The particular smell of cornbread and fried chicken, the low hum of the fluorescent lights, the exact worn groove in the counter where countless elbows have rested over decades. Corinne sets a plate down in front of him a few minutes later. Fried chicken, collard greens, a thick slice of cornbread, the same combination she has served to thousands of strangers for 46 years. The plate itself is simple white ceramic, chipped slightly at one edge from decades of use, steam rising gently off the food into the cool diner air. Shaq looks down at the plate, and something in his chest tightens unexpectedly. "This is going to sound strange," he says slowly, looking up at her. "But I think I might have eaten here before. A long time ago." Corain studies his face for a moment, the practiced patience of a woman who has heard 1,000 customers claim familiarity with her cooking over the decades. "Lots of folks say that," she says gently. "Cornbread tends to taste like somebody's memory, whether they've actually been here or not." "No," Shaq says, more certain now, something surfacing slowly from 33 years back. "My car broke down. On this street, I think, a long time ago. A woman fed me a plate just like this one and wouldn't let me pay for it." Corain goes very still, her rag pausing mid-motion against the counter, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studies his face more carefully now, searching for something beneath the decades and the fame and the enormous frame in front of her, the way a person searches an old photograph for a face they once knew well but have not thought about in a very long time. "What year?" she says quietly, though it is barely a question, more a statement bracing for an answer she already half believes, her hand still pressed flat against the counter's worn surface. 1993, Shaq says. "March. I was a rookie. My car died 3 blocks from here." Corinne's hand comes up slowly to cover her mouth, the rag falling forgotten from her other hand onto the counter. For a long moment, she says nothing at all, simply staring at him, 46 years of faces behind that counter suddenly narrowing down to one specific cold March night she had genuinely never expected to matter this much. "You told me not to forget to feed people," Shaq says softly, "when I got wherever I was going. I don't think I ever forgot that. I don't think I ever fully understood how much I owed that sentence, though, until right now." "I remember that car," Corain says slowly, a small, disbelieving laugh escaping through her tears, one hand pressed to her chest as the memory settles fully into place. "Old brown sedan, wasn't it? Steam coming up from under the hood like a kettle. Otis went out to look at it with you before the tow truck came. Told me later he figured you for a football player, not a basketball one, on account of those shoulders." "Baseball, actually, is what I told him I played in high school," Shaq says, laughing softly through his own emotion now. "He didn't believe me either." "No," Corain says, wiping her eyes with the corner of her apron. "I don't suppose he did." She sets both hands flat on the counter, steadying herself, looking at him now the way a person looks at a puzzle piece finally sliding into place after 33 years of sitting unnoticed in the wrong box. "Lord have mercy. All these years, and I never once put it together, watching you on that television." But here is where the story does not stay simple, because when Corain finally found her voice again, what she told Shaq next revealed something about that Friday night's closing that went far beyond a leaking roof and unpaid taxes. Before he left the diner that first night, Shaq sat with Corain for another hour, long after his plate had been cleared away, listening as she told him small pieces of the diner's history, careful not to ask directly about the closing itself, letting her share only what she seemed willing to offer. Walter Higgins, still nursing his coffee at the far end of the counter, joined the conversation occasionally, adding his own memories of decades spent in that exact seat. When Shaq finally stood to leave, ducking automatically beneath the low doorway, he pressed a business card into Corinne's hand with Dana's direct number written on the back, asking only that she call if she ever wanted to talk further, making no promises, no offers, nothing that might feel like pressure on a woman who had clearly made peace with a difficult decision. Corinne took the card without comment, tucking it into her apron pocket, though she did not throw it away. He drove the rest of the way to his hotel in near silence, the radio off, the note's 4 sentences replaying in his mind alongside a memory he had not thought about clearly in over 3 decades. He sat on the edge of his hotel bed for a long while that night, phone in hand, deciding, finally, close to midnight, to call Dana first thing in the morning rather than let the feeling pass with the night's sleep. He had not slept well that night, staying at a small hotel near the airport instead of catching his morning flight as planned, calling to push his departure back a full day without yet knowing exactly what he intended to do with the extra time. He sat by the window as the sun came up, replaying the conversation from the night before, the note, the plate, the particular way Corinne's hand had come up to cover her mouth when the pieces finally clicked into place. Before calling Dana, he called his mother, still early enough that he knew she'd be up with her coffee. He told her the whole story, the note on the door, the broken-down car 33 years earlier, the plate of chicken and cornbread he'd never fully forgotten but had somehow let blur into the general shape of a kinder memory. "A woman fed you when you had nothing to give back," his mother said softly, once he'd finished. "And now the Lord's put you right back in her kitchen the one night she needed feeding herself. Baby, that's not coincidence. That's a circle closing exactly the way it was always going to close." "That's what it feels like," Shaq admitted. "Then you already know what you're going to do," his mother said. "You've known since you sat down on that bench outside instead of walking straight in. Go finish it properly." The next morning, Shaq called Dana Whitfield before he had even finished his coffee at the hotel. "I need you to look into a diner in Macon, Georgia," he said. "Corinne's Kitchen. The owner's name is Corinne Duval. She's closing tonight after 46 years, and I need to understand exactly why, and exactly what it would take to change that, if she's willing." "Give me the short version first," Dana said, already pulling her laptop toward her on the other end of the line. "What happened?" Shaq told her about the note on the door, about sitting down on the bench outside instead of walking straight in, about the plate of chicken and cornbread that unlocked a memory he hadn't fully thought about in over 3 decades. "She fed me," he said simply, "back when I had nothing to offer her but an empty wallet. I didn't even fully remember her name until last night." Dana had worked for Shaq long enough to recognize, from the particular careful quiet in his voice, that this request carried more weight than most. "I'll have something for you within a few hours," she said. Dana started with the county property records, quickly confirming what Corinne had already told Shaq the night before. 4 months behind on property taxes, a total owed just under $11,000, a roof repair estimate from a local contractor running close to $18,000 more. She cross-referenced the building's ownership history, confirming Corinne held the deed outright, free and clear of any mortgage, the one piece of good fortune in an otherwise complicated financial picture, meaning the tax debt alone stood between Corinne and keeping the building entirely her own. Dana also pulled the diner's public reviews and mentions across the past decade, finding page after page of warm, consistent praise, not just for the food but for the atmosphere, the sense, repeated in review after review, that walking through that door felt less like visiting a restaurant and more like being welcomed into somebody's own kitchen. But it was in speaking with several long-time customers, reached through a combination of old newspaper features and word of mouth around the neighborhood, that Dana uncovered something Corinne herself had never once mentioned to Shaq, and had in fact never mentioned to almost anyone at all. Dana found Walter Higgins through a mention in a decade-old community newsletter, a short article about the diner's 25th anniversary that quoted him praising Corinne's cooking. She called the number listed for the neighborhood association, was passed along twice, and finally reached him directly on his home phone that same afternoon. An elderly regular named Walter Higgins, 74 years old, a retired mail carrier who had eaten breakfast at Corinne's kitchen nearly every single morning for over 20 years, told Dana a story that made her sit back from her laptop in quiet disbelief. "You want to know about Corinne?" Walter said, settling into what was clearly a comfortable, well-worn subject for him. "You're going to need more than a phone call, but I'll give you the short version." He cleared his throat, the sound of a man gathering decades of memory into something tellable. "Corinne's got a ledger," Walter explained. "An old paper one she keeps behind the counter. Anybody who came in hungry and couldn't pay, going all the way back to the 80s, she'd write their name down in that book instead of turning them away. Told them to pay when they could. No interest, no pressure, no shame about it. Half this neighborhood's eaten free meals off that ledger at one point or another, especially during hard years. Most of us paid her back eventually, when we could. But I know for a fact there's names in that book going back decades that never got crossed off, and Corinne never once chased a single person down about it." "Did you ever end up in that ledger yourself?" Dana asked gently. Walter was quiet for a moment before answering. "1991, he said. "Lost my job at the post office for 6 weeks during a round of layoffs, before they finally brought me back. My wife was pregnant with our first that year. Corinne fed my family breakfast every single morning of those 6 weeks, and never once mentioned money. Wrote my name down, told me to settle up whenever I got back on my feet. I paid her back the day I got my first paycheck again, plus a little extra she tried to refuse. That woman raised half this neighborhood's children on quiet kindness nobody outside these walls ever heard about." Dana sat with that information for a long moment before calling Shaq back. "She's been quietly feeding this entire neighborhood on credit for 46 years, Dana told him. "An honor system, no interest, no collections, nothing. I talked to 5 different people who told me stories about meals they got during hard stretches, lost jobs, sick kids, funerals they couldn't afford to feed a family before. She never once turned anyone away. One woman told me about the week her husband died," Dana continued quietly. "Said she couldn't bring herself to cook for weeks afterward. And Corinne sent plates home with her teenage son every single evening for almost a month, never once mentioning payment, never once making the family feel like charity cases. Another man told me Corinne fed his entire construction crew for free during a slow winter when work dried up, feeding 12 grown men 3 times a week for 2 months straight. There was one story that stuck with me more than the others," Dana added quietly. "A woman named Miss Pearline, elderly now, told me Corinne fed her and her 3 grandchildren for nearly a year back in the early 2000s, after Pearline took the kids in when her own daughter passed suddenly. Pearline said she never had a way to pay it back in money, so she started coming in every Sunday afternoon instead, just to help wash dishes for a few hours. Said Corinne never once asked her to, but never once turned her away from helping either." Shaq closed his eyes, absorbing this. "The same woman who fed a broke rookie without blinking," he said slowly, "has apparently been doing that for half the town for 46 years. "It gets more complicated," Dana said. "I pulled together rough numbers from what people described. If even a fraction of those unpaid meals were ever formally tracked as losses, we're talking about tens of thousands of dollars in food she simply gave away over 4 decades. Money that would have more than covered her back taxes and that roof repair many times over if she'd ever once been willing to ask for it back. She'd rather close the doors," Shaq said quietly, "than ask people who couldn't pay to pay her back now." "That's exactly what it looks like," Dana said. Shaq sat with the full weight of that for a long moment, thinking about a cold March night 33 years earlier, about a woman who had fed him without a single question, about the particular kind of quiet, stubborn generosity that asked for nothing in return and expected nothing to be owed. He drove back to Corinne's kitchen that same afternoon, this time not as a stranger passing through, but as someone who understood, now, exactly what kind of last night he had almost let pass by unremarked. The diner was closed for the day when he arrived, a hand-lettered sign in the window reading "Back in an hour," though Simone let him in through the side door when she recognized him through the glass. He found Corinne in the diner's small back office, a cramped room barely large enough for a desk and a filing cabinet, going through papers one final time before locking up for good. A single bare bulb hung overhead, casting harsh light across stacks of receipts, tax notices, and a worn accounting ledger sitting closed at the corner of the desk. She looked up, startled, when he appeared in the doorway, one hand still resting on a stack of papers she had been sorting. "Mr. O'Neill," she said, setting down the papers in her hands. "I didn't expect to see you again." "I heard about the ledger," Shaq said gently, stepping carefully into the small room, ducking beneath a low shelf. "The one behind the counter. The names of people you fed and never asked to pay back." Corinne's face tightened slightly, a flush of embarrassment crossing her features. her hand instinctively moving toward the closed accounting book at the corner of her desk, as if to shield it from view. "That's not something I ever talk about," she said. "It wasn't charity. It was just how you run a diner in a neighborhood like this one. You feed people first." "How many names, Corinne?" Shaq asked gently. "In that ledger, rough guess." She was quiet for a moment, her eyes drifting to the closed accounting book at the corner of her desk. The real ledger, the one she'd never once shown a stranger. "I couldn't tell you exactly," she admitted. "Hundreds, probably, over 46 years. Most paid back eventually, some couldn't. A few passed on before they ever got the chance." Her voice caught slightly on that last part. "I never kept it to collect on it, Mr. O'Neill. I kept it so nobody ever had to feel ashamed asking for a plate of food in my kitchen." "I know," Shaq said. "You fed me first too, 33 years ago, and you never once asked for anything back. I think it's time somebody finally paid that particular debt forward, on behalf of everybody whose name is sitting in that ledger." Corinne stared at him for a long moment, clearly working to understand exactly what he was offering. "Mr. O'Neill," she said carefully, "I don't need charity. I've run this business honest for 46 years. I'd rather close these doors with my dignity intact than open them back up owing somebody something I can't repay." She stood from her chair, pacing the small width of the cramped office, arms crossed over her chest. "You don't understand," she continued. "I've watched proud people lose themselves once they start accepting help they can't pay back. I've fed enough of them to know what it does to a person, little by little. I won't do that to myself, not after 46 years of standing on my own 2 feet." "This isn't charity," Shaq said firmly. "This is 33 years overdue payment for a plate of chicken and cornbread, plus 46 years of interest on every meal you never let this neighborhood pay you back for. I'd like to settle the tax debt, cover the roof repair, and help you keep these doors open, if that's something you still want. Not because you need saving, because you never once asked to be, and that's exactly the kind of person worth showing up for." Corinne's composure finally cracked, tears slipping down her face as she pressed one hand against the edge of her desk to steady herself. 46 years, she said softly, "and I never once expected anything to come back around from any of it." "Maybe that's exactly why it did," Shaq said gently. "But wait," Dana said, stepping into the doorway behind him, having driven down separately to help with the details. "Mrs. Duval, there's something else you should know before you decide anything." Corinne looked between them, wiping her eyes, waiting. "The buyer who's been trying to purchase this building," Dana said carefully, "the development company. I looked into them this morning. They've already secured permits to demolish this entire block within the next 18 months for a mixed-use apartment complex. If you'd sold to them, this building, this exact counter, would have been gone by next spring regardless of the price they offered you. They approached me twice this year," Corinne said slowly, sinking down into the chair behind her desk as if the weight of the revelation had finally caught up with her legs. "Both times I told them I wasn't ready. Both times they said they'd wait, no rush. Whenever I changed my mind, the offer would still be good." "That's because they already had what they needed," Dana said gently. "The permits don't depend on your decision, Mrs. Duval. They were simply waiting for the most convenient moment to make you an offer you'd feel like you had no choice but to accept." Corinne's hand came up to her mouth again, absorbing this new weight. "I had no idea," she whispered. "I just thought I was selling to whoever offered fastest. I never asked what they planned to do with it." "You would have lost it either way," Dana said gently. "Selling would have just meant losing it faster, and without ever getting the chance to keep serving the people who've depended on this place for decades." Shaq stepped closer, his voice steady and certain. "That's exactly why I'm asking you to let us help settle the debt instead. Not so the building changes hands, so it stays exactly what it's always been, with you still standing behind that counter for as long as you want to be there." Corinne was quiet for a long moment, looking around the small, cramped office at 4 decades of paperwork, receipts, and photographs pinned haphazardly to a corkboard behind her desk. Her eyes moved slowly across a faded photo of Otis in his apron, a child's crayon drawing Simone had made decades earlier still tacked in one corner, a handful of thank you cards collected over the years from customers who had found the words to say what most never did. "Otis would have liked you," she finally said, her voice thick with emotion. "He always said the Lord sends the right stranger through the door exactly when you need one, even when you don't know you're waiting." "I think he sent you through my door first," Shaq said quietly. 33 years ago. I'm just finally getting around to returning the favor." Simone had grown up 2 blocks from the diner herself, spending most of her childhood summers perched on the same stool Shaq now occupied, doing homework at the counter while her grandmother worked, absorbing, without ever quite realizing it, the particular rhythm of a kitchen run on equal parts hard work and quiet generosity. She had left for a few years after high school, chasing a hospitality management degree at a college 2 hours away, always intending to return home eventually, though the leaking roof and mounting debts had pulled that timeline forward faster than she'd planned. She had come home 8 months earlier than originally intended, moving back into her childhood bedroom above her mother's old house, taking the part-time pharmacy job to cover her own expenses while spending every spare hour she could at the diner, watching helplessly as the math grew harder and harder to make work no matter how many extra shifts either of them picked up. Simone, who had been standing quietly in the doorway during most of the conversation, finally spoke up, her voice thick with emotion. "Grandma, please," she said. "Let him help. I've watched you carry this place alone since Grandpa died. You don't have to carry it alone anymore." Corinne looked at her granddaughter for a long moment, seeing, perhaps for the first time, exactly how much weight the younger woman had been quietly absorbing alongside her these past difficult months. "You really want to keep doing this?" she asked softly. "Long hours, hard work, a kitchen that'll test every bit of patience you've got?" "I want to keep the ledger open," Simone said simply. "That's what I want, whatever it takes to make that happen." Corinne reached out and took her granddaughter's hand, then looked back at Shaq, something settling in her expression, resolve replacing the last of her resistance. "All right," she said quietly. "All right, let's talk about what this would actually look like. One condition," she added, holding up a finger before Shaq could respond. "My name stays on the deed. My name stays on the register. Whatever help you're offering, this stays my kitchen, run my way, until the day I decide otherwise. I've spent 46 years building something with my own 2 hands. I'm not interested in becoming somebody else's charity case with my name still hanging on the sign." "That's exactly how I want it," Shaq said immediately. "I'm not buying a diner, Mrs. Duval. I'm just making sure the woman who fed me when I had nothing gets the chance to keep doing what she loves, on her own terms, for as long as she wants to do it." Corinne studied his face for a long moment, searching, one final time, for any trace of the transaction feeling like anything other than what he claimed it was. Apparently satisfied, she nodded once, firmly, the same decisive nod, Shaq imagined, that had settled countless decisions across that counter over 4 decades. Within the following 2 weeks, working quietly through his foundation, Shaq settled Corinne's outstanding property tax debt in full, and arranged for a full roof replacement, completed by a local contractor Dana vetted personally, chosen specifically because the man's own mother had once been one of the names quietly written into Corinne's ledger decades earlier, without ever knowing anyone else had seen it. The contractor, a soft-spoken man named Marcus Ellison, 48 years old, teared up openly on the day he first climbed onto the roof to assess the damage, telling Dana quietly that his mother, a single parent working 2 jobs through most of his childhood, had eaten more than a few free breakfasts at that same counter during the hardest years of his upbringing, years he remembered clearly even though he'd been too young at the time to understand exactly what kindness was keeping his family fed. "I'd have done this roof for free if she'd let me," Marcus told Dana. "This place fed me when I didn't have much else. Least I can do is make sure the roof over it holds up for another 46 years. Corinne, ever proud, insisted on paying him something for the labor despite his protests, settling finally on a modest rate far below what the job was actually worth, an arrangement Marcus accepted only because refusing entirely would have wounded her pride more than accepting a fair wage ever could. He spent 4 days on that roof in the cold December air, working from sunrise until the light gave out each afternoon, replacing rotted beams and decades-old shingles with the same careful attention he might have given his own mother's house. Simone brought him hot coffee and plates of food up to the roof twice a day, the 2 of them striking up an easy, comfortable friendship over those 4 cold days that would continue, in the months that followed, well beyond the roof itself, the 2 of them eventually beginning to date quietly by the following spring, a small, unplanned blessing neither of them had expected to find on a cold rooftop in December. On the final afternoon, climbing down from the ladder for the last time, Marcus found Corinne waiting for him with a plate of food and a cup of coffee. The same gesture, he realized, she must have offered 1,000 tired workers over 4 decades. "Your mother still likes her eggs over easy?" Corinne asked him, smiling. "Some things I never forget, even 40 years later." Dana had driven down to Macon in person the following week to help finalize the paperwork, preferring, for something this personal, to handle the details face-to-face rather than over email. The drive from Atlanta took just under 2 hours, and she spent most of it thinking through exactly how to approach a woman who had already made clear, once, that she wasn't interested in being treated like a charity case. She arrived at the diner on a quiet Tuesday morning, before the breakfast rush, finding Corinne already at the counter sorting through a fresh delivery of coffee filters, the morning radio playing low behind her, the smell of biscuits just beginning to rise from the oven. "You must be Dana," Corinne said, looking up with a warm, appraising glance. "Shaq's told me about you, says you're the one who does all the real work while he gets the credit." Dana laughed, surprised by the directness. "Something like that," she admitted. "Well, sit down," Corinne said, already reaching for a coffee cup. "Can't do business on an empty stomach. That's rule number 1 around here, and it's not up for negotiation." They spent the next 2 hours at the counter, working through paperwork between bites of biscuits and gravy, Corinne asking sharp, practical questions about every dollar being spent, insisting on understanding every detail before signing a single form. She read every line of every document twice, occasionally pausing to ask Dana to clarify a term in plain language rather than legal phrasing, unwilling to sign anything she did not fully understand regardless of how much trust she had already placed in the people offering to help her. Dana found herself, more than once, genuinely impressed by the older woman's careful mind, a sharpness that had clearly kept a small business afloat through 4 decades of changing circumstances. "You remind me of myself 40 years ago," Corinne told her at one point, studying Dana over her coffee cup. "Sharp, careful, doesn't miss a detail. Shaq's lucky to have you watching his back. He's easy to work for," Dana said, "especially on days like this one." Shaq insisted the arrangement carry no public announcement, no press release, nothing that would turn Corinne's 46 years of quiet generosity into a headline she never wanted. The only new addition to the diner, installed the week before it reopened, was a small brass plaque mounted discreetly near the register, reading simply, "The ledger stays open. All are fed first." Corinne's granddaughter Simone, 24 years old, who had been quietly grieving the diner's closing for weeks, began working full-time at the counter after the reopening. Learning the business her grandmother had built one careful lesson at a time, determined to carry the ledger tradition forward for whatever decades came next. Word of the diner's reopening moved slowly through the Macon community, the way meaningful things tend to move in neighborhoods built on decades of quiet familiarity rather than headlines. Regulars who had said tearful goodbyes weeks earlier returned to find the same counter, the same cornbread, the same worn stools, and a small brass plaque that told them, without a single word of explanation needed, exactly what kind of place they had walked back into. A young mother named Destiny Coleman, 26 years old, who had brought her 2 children in for what she believed would be the diner's very last breakfast, returned 3 weeks later in tears of an entirely different kind when she saw the lights back on. She had been struggling that autumn after losing her job, her own name quietly added to the ledger during those final difficult weeks before the closing, and she told Simone, through tears, that she had spent weeks worrying about how she would ever pay that debt back now that the place was gone. She had lost her position at a local warehouse in October, part of a round of layoffs that hit dozens of workers across the county without warning, leaving her scrambling to feed 2 young children on a rapidly shrinking savings account. She had walked into Corinne's kitchen that final week not looking for a handout, simply hoping the familiar counter might offer some small comfort during an otherwise frightening stretch, and had been quietly moved to tears when Corinne, without being asked, waved away payment and told her the same thing she'd told hundreds of others over the decades: "Pay it back when you can, not one day before." Her 2 children, 5 and 7 years old, had eaten quietly that evening, unaware of the quiet act of grace their mother had just been offered, focused only on the plates of cornbread in front of them. Exactly the kind of ordinary childhood moment Corinne had spent 46 years quietly protecting for families across her entire neighborhood. "You don't owe anything you can't give," Simone told her, echoing the same words she'd heard her grandmother say 1,000 times growing up. "Pay it back when you're able. That's how it's always worked here, and that's how it's going to keep working." Destiny had spent the following weeks applying to every hospital and clinic within driving distance, finally landing a position in patient intake at Macon's main medical center, her first paycheck arriving just 3 days before the diner's reopening. She had walked in that first evening back, both her children in tow, and asked Simone, quietly, exactly how much she owed. Simone had checked the ledger, told her the number, and watched Destiny pay every cent of it on the spot, then insist on leaving an extra $20 for whoever needs it next. A retired schoolteacher named Mr. Aldridge, who had eaten lunch at the counter every Wednesday for 15 years, brought a handwritten card the week the diner reopened, thanking Corinne for 4 decades of feeding a neighborhood that didn't always have the words to thank her properly. He left it tucked under the edge of a napkin dispenser, unsigned, though Corinne recognized his handwriting immediately. A local barber shop 2 doors down began sending customers over during slow afternoons, a quiet informal partnership that had existed for years but deepened noticeably after the reopening. The barber telling his own regulars that a haircut wasn't complete without a plate of Corinne's cornbread to go with it. The barber shop's owner, a man named Curtis, who had known Corinne since childhood, started keeping a small stack of the diner's business cards on his own counter, a gesture Corinne returned by keeping a jar of his shop's business cards near her own register. 2 small businesses quietly propping each other up the way neighbors on the same block had always done for one another, long before either of them had a name for what that kind of quiet mutual support was even called. A young couple who had gotten engaged in the corner booth 11 years earlier returned for their anniversary dinner that December, requesting the same booth, telling Simone they'd been heartbroken at the thought of the diner closing before they ever got the chance to bring their own children there someday. By the following spring, word of the diner's story had spread far enough that a regional magazine ran a short, warm feature on Corinne's kitchen, focused entirely on the ledger tradition and the community it had quietly built over 4 decades. Careful, at Corinne's insistence, never to mention Shaq's name or involvement at all. The reporter, a young woman named Alicia Prescott, spent 3 separate afternoons at the counter researching the piece, interviewing Walter Higgins, Destiny Coleman, and a half-dozen other regulars who lined up eagerly to share their own memories, eventually writing that Corinne's kitchen represented exactly the kind of quiet neighborhood institution that keeps a community's heart beating long after the headlines move elsewhere. The feature ran with a photograph of Corinne standing proudly behind her counter, the framed note visible on the door behind her. And within a week of publication, the diner saw more new customers walk through its doors than it had in the previous 2 years combined. Curious strangers drawn not by advertising, but by the simple, honest story of a woman who fed her neighborhood first and worried about the register second. Walter Higgins, the retired mail carrier, became something of an informal historian of the ledger's new chapter, telling anyone who asked about the night a stranger's car broke down on Vineville Avenue in 1993. And what that one plate of chicken and cornbread eventually grew into, 33 years later. 1 year later, on a cold Friday evening in December, exactly 1 year after that first note appeared taped to the glass, Corinne's kitchen was full in a way it had not been full in years. Every stool at the counter occupied, every table seated, the small dining room warm with conversation, and the smell of cornbread rising fresh from the oven. The Christmas lights above the window, half burned out a year earlier, had been fully replaced, glowing bright, and even now along the frame, a new string added along the doorway as well, Simone's addition, insisting the place deserved to look as cared for on the outside as it felt on the inside. Walter Higgins sat in his usual spot at the counter, working through a plate of fried chicken and talking animatedly with a younger couple seated beside him, clearly retelling once again the story of the stranger's car that broke down on Vineville Avenue in 1993. Marcus Ellison, the contractor, had stopped by earlier that evening with his own mother, now in her 70s, the 2 of them sharing a booth near the window, her hand resting proudly on her son's arm as she told anyone who would listen about the roof he'd fixed for the woman who once fed her family through hard times decades earlier. Destiny Coleman sat near the back with her 2 children, both of them considerably taller than they'd been a year earlier, her own new hospital badge clipped proudly to her jacket. She caught Corinne's eye across the room and raised her coffee cup in a small, grateful toast, a gesture Corinne returned with a warm smile before turning back to the grill. Even the young engaged couple from years earlier, now married with a toddler of their own, had claimed their favorite corner booth for the evening, exactly as they'd promised they eventually would. Shaq returned that evening, ducking through the same narrow doorway, settling onto the same stool at the end of the counter where he had first remembered a debt 33 years overdue. Corinne, 80 years old now, moved a little slower behind the counter than she had the year before, but moved there still, refusing every suggestion that she finally retire completely, insisting the ledger needed her steady hand at the register for at least a while longer. Simone worked the grill beside her now, with practiced confidence, having grown, over the past year, into exactly the kind of steady presence her grandmother had once been for this same counter. Her own handwriting now filling nearly half the newest pages of the ledger, each entry made with the same careful, unhurried patience she had learned by watching 4 decades of Corain's example. A torch passed quietly from one generation to the next, without either of them ever needing to say so out loud. 1 year, she said, setting a plate down in front of him, fried chicken, collard greens, cornbread, the same meal she had served him twice now across 34 years. Never thought I'd get another one of these anniversaries, 47 years now, Shaq said, smiling. The ledger's still open. Still open, Corain confirmed, her eyes glistening. Simone tells me we've added 11 new names to it this year alone. 11 families who needed a plate before they could pay for one. Destiny Coleman's back on her feet now, Corain added. Got a new job at the hospital. First thing she did was come pay off what she owed. Then left $20 more than she needed to. Told Simone to add it to somebody else's tab instead. That's exactly how it should work, Shaq said quietly. Corain reached over and patted his enormous hand with her own smaller one. The same gesture, Shaq realized, she had likely offered 1,000 other tired strangers, across this exact counter over 47 years. You know, she said, Otis always told me the Lord keeps better books than any ledger I could write by hand. I believe him a little more every year. I think he'd be proud of what this place has become, Shaq said quietly, looking around at the full, warm room. He'd be proud it's still standing, Corain corrected gently. That was always the only thing that mattered to him. Not how big it got, just that the door stayed open for whoever needed it. They sat together for a while longer, the diner humming warmly around them. 47 years of quiet kindness folded seamlessly into one more ordinary, crowded Friday night. Before he left, Shaq walked over to the corkboard behind the register, where the faded photograph of young Corain and Otis still hung beside dozens of newer pictures added over the past year. Regulars, reopening day, Simone's first solo shift on the grill. Corain walked him to the door as the evening wound down, the same door where a torn note had once hung taped to the glass. In its place now hung a small framed copy of that same note, preserved rather than discarded, a reminder rather than a goodbye. I kept it, Corain said, noticing him looking at it. Simone framed it for me, said the neighborhood ought to remember how close we came to losing this place, so nobody takes it for granted again. Good idea, Shaq said quietly, studying the familiar 4 sentences one more time. Some notes are worth keeping around, even after the ending changes. Corain reached up and squeezed his arm before he ducked back out into the cold. Drive safe, Mr. O'Neill, she said, and don't be a stranger. This counter's got a stool for you anytime you're passing through. I'll hold you to that, Shaq said, smiling, before stepping out into the December night, the warm glow of the diner's window shrinking slowly behind him as he walked back toward his car. His breath visible once more in the cold air, the same wooden bench sitting empty now beside the door where he had once sat frozen for 9 long seconds a year earlier. He paused at his car door for a moment, looking back at the small brick building one last time, the string of Christmas lights glowing steady above the window, the framed note catching the light faintly through the glass. Then he climbed in, started the engine, and pulled slowly out of the gravel lot, already thinking, somewhere in the back of his mind, about which Friday in December he might find his way back to Vineville Avenue again next year. Because somewhere out there right now, someone is standing behind a counter, or a register, or a desk, quietly extending a kindness they never expect to see repaid. This story is a reminder that those quiet debts do not disappear simply because nobody keeps score. Sometimes, decades later, they find their way back around, exactly when the person who gave so freely needs it returned the most. And sometimes the smallest plate of food, offered without a single question asked, becomes the exact thing that teaches a stranger what kind of person he still has time to become. Maybe you are the one who has been quietly giving for years without expecting anything back. If that's you, this story is a reminder that kindness like that is never actually lost. It is simply waiting, patiently, for its own turn to come home. And maybe you are the one who has been quietly struggling, too proud to ask for help, telling yourself you'd rather close the door with your dignity intact than owe anyone anything. If that's you too, this story is a reminder that accepting help from someone whose life you once touched isn't a loss of dignity at all. Sometimes it's simply the debt finally being allowed to travel home. Somewhere on Vineville Avenue tonight, a small brass plaque catches the light above a busy register, and a ledger, older than most of the customers now writing their names into it, sits open and ready for whoever walks through that door hungry and unable to pay. Exactly the way it has for 47 years, and exactly the way it will, if Corinne and Simone have anything to say about it, for many years still to come. Before you go, drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. We read every single one, and we love knowing how far these stories travel around the world. And if this story moved you even a little, please hit that like button right now. It takes 1 second, and it helps this story reach someone out there who might need to be reminded that their own quiet generosity still matters. And if you're new here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button and join a community that believes the smallest kindnesses are often the ones that travel the farthest. Share this video with one person today, just one. Because that is exactly how a ledger like Corinne's stays open for 47 years and counting. One plate, one kindness, one debt quietly repaid at a time. Now click on the video appearing on your screen right now, because the next story we have for you is just as powerful as this one. We will see you there.